Welcome to Season 4 of my podcast, Between Us, Stories of Unconscious Bias. I've added the title Between Us as I thought stories of unconscious bias alone was a little too remote. My hope was that the podcast would feature honest and personal stories that raise awareness and educate. Between Us as a main title underlines the intimacy while reinforcing the sense of our collective involvement. Since launching it in early May 2020, the world has again changed. George Floyd died, and Black Lives Matter, which had started in 2013, has become more popular and more widely accepted. Identity politics and culture wars have deepened in the UK and the US. Meanwhile, in other countries, people are being marginalised for their religion and beliefs. The need to understand the subject of unconscious bias has taken on ever more meaning and resonance. As always, I am so grateful to all my wonderful speakers who share their often brave stories and allow us to understand the nuances of this very important subject. Thank you for listening. I'd like to introduce Baroness Helena Kennedy QC. Helena is one of Britain's most distinguished lawyers. She has spent her professional life giving voice to those who have least power within the system, championing civil liberties and promoting human rights. In an interview from a few years ago, Helena was asked about her best and worst days of work. Successes like the release of Paul Hill, one of the Guildford Four, is a given. But what was moving and powerful was to hear Helena talk of supporting and winning the case with the battered women who killed their husbands after years of abuse, or the wife of the bomb plotter accused of failing to inform on her husband, or the gay man arrested by some prurient vice court officer as he left a gay club. Helena has conducted many prominent cases of terrorism, official secrets, and homicide. She's the founding force behind the establishment of the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights at the University of Oxford. In 1997, Helena was elevated to the House of Lords, where she is a Labour peer. She has published 2 books on how the justice system is failing women and has written and broadcasted on many issues over the years. Currently, she has taken on the role of director to the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute. She directs the Institute's work upholding the rule of law and human rights globally. I am so very thrilled that Baroness Helena Kennedy is joining me today to share her stories of unconscious bias. Thank you so very much, Helena. Before we even discuss stories, what do you understand by these 2 simple words, unconscious bias?
It's very easy to talk about bias, and bias, of course, is one of those things that as lawyers operating in the courts, and I work in the criminal courts, if we get a sense of any kind of bias, lack of impartiality from the judiciary is something that we are all too aware of. And so bias is something that is part of one's training, and one learns throughout one's professional life to be alert to it operating in others, and also to become aware of ways in which we have our own biases. Now, unconscious biases are those biases which are so deep-seated that we're not even aware of them. I'm conscious of certain biases that I have. I'm drawn to certain kinds of people. I'm aware that of course, we're more inclined to find comfort in the companionship of others who are like ourselves. And when I say that, I mean, I love being with other women who are smart and intelligent and fun, and I'm biased in their direction. And I also am rather kind of biased against people who are very judgmental and who make decisions about people because of how they lead their lives or because they're different and so on. And so I'm conscious of the ways in which I have my own biases, and I try to challenge them within myself. Unconscious bias is that which is so deep rooted that it's quite hard to even get to. And those are the sorts of biases that people always deny having. There are the obvious things that happen. Let me just talk about the ways in which this has been very much evident in my own work. When I was a young lawyer, I came from a big working class family in Glasgow. We were from an Irish Catholic background. I'd been brought up in a city, Glasgow, which was full of sectarianism. Happily, that is dissipating as with time, and I'm glad to say that it's very different. I think now it's not all gone, but some of those biases against Catholics, which I was brought up with, and to be fearful of, and to be made aware of the fact that as a Catholic, that we may face prejudice, bias, and that we may therefore not get jobs, not get into certain institutions or places that we might want to go. That was what I was brought up with, to know that we may be at the receiving end of bias, and bias which may be conscious or unconscious. So sectarianism gives rise to that. And I'm sure that if people are brought up in places in which there are firm and hard divisions in society, then they become very conscious of bias and the unfairness that goes with bias, the judging of people on stereotypes and on basically grouping you in a way that doesn't look at you as an individual. So unconscious bias has figured as a large thing in my life personally, but also when I came down to London to study, and then I became a barrister here in London, I was part of a very small group. Not many women went to the bar in the early 70s. I qualified in 1972, so it tells you the great age that I now am. And there were very few women. There were only 7% of practitioners were women. And those who were usually women from quite different social backgrounds from me. But I began to look at the world then through the eyes of another bias, which was based on gender, that people who were women were not considered to be as rational or as suited to the professionalism of the bar. And if they were going to be in the profession, they should go off and look after cases involving children, involving marital disputes, and the appropriate areas for women as it was thought at the time. I entered the world of criminal law. It was considered then to be very much a male domain because of the ugly side of human nature that was involved in criminality. And I saw very clearly then the ways in which biases, sometimes overt, but sometimes unconscious, operated. Judges would claim that they were being chivalrous in the ways that they treated women. But if women didn't conform to ideas of what good womanhood looked like, then they often were quite punitive towards women who perhaps were promiscuous, or perhaps were slovenly, or were not good mothers, or in their view weren't good wives. Even if that wasn't the issue before the court, but they were judging women in ways that live deep in the hearts of people. And so it was interesting to see how the system of law could be affected by personal attitudes towards certain kinds of people. And we know this happens the world over, the discriminations against lower caste people in India, discriminations against the Roma all the way across Eastern Europe, the assumptions that the Roma are criminal and so on. Discriminations that operate against Black people. You have to ask the question, why is there more stopping and searching of young Black men? And the assumption is that they're going to be more criminal. And it doesn't matter how respectable you look, and it doesn't matter if you're driving in a decent car. In fact, it's almost an incentive for the police to stop you if you're driving in a rather fancy looking car, because the assumption is that if you're Black and you're in a fancy car, it must be the proceeds of crime. And so lots of judges and lawyers that I know would themselves experience that kind of bias. Unconscious bias is that stuff that lives much deeper in people's souls, but it usually comes from stereotyping people, making assumptions, grouping people together. That's why I hate that expression BAME, Black and minority ethnic.
Yes.
Hate it because it rolls together such hugely different cultural experiences and individual experiences.
I agree.
And so, but But what we know is that people harbor those deeply unconscious thoughts about particular groupings of people. So, for example, I remember back in the, I started writing about the position of women even in the late 70s, about discriminations, both within the profession, that women had harder time getting into sets of chambers and so on. And then, and the same was experienced by people from ethnic minorities. And we, in the 80s, we were making a louder argument for the judges to become much more conscious of the ways in which assumptions were being made about people from minorities. And what they started realizing was that, for example, when people from certain Asian cultures came before the courts, and because of the teaching of respect for your elders and for people in particular positions, like a judge, that you didn't look people straight in the eye, that you actually were supposed to keep your head lowered and not be, in an insolent way, facing up someone of seniority or your elder.
I'm just smiling when I'm hearing the story of the fact that just because you're of a particular culture, the expectation is that you can't look somebody in the eye.
Oh. I remember judges saying, we've got to be very careful, because Asians often, they don't look you in the eye and therefore you think they're a liar. And it just seemed like a madness to me. And then I remember assumptions like that being made about, for example, women. When women came before the courts and spoke about having been battered or abused physically by partners, there were assumptions about what would a battered woman, what would an abused woman be like? And they assumed that she would have to be a very meek and sad soul. And so if a woman appeared before the court and seemed to be somewhat vivacious and lively, they found it hard to believe that such a person could be abused. And
it's about ticking the boxes, isn't it, Helena? It's about, if you're a battered woman, then you have to look whatever the judge feels battered should look like. And if you don't look and you don't fit into that particular box, then their unconscious bias could be kicking in and not supporting the fact that you have been battered by an abusive partner at home.
Yeah, and it was so interesting that people used to say things like, well, how was she able to hold down a job? If somebody actually worked outside of the home but was abused inside the home, well, how was she able to hold down a job and go out and serve behind a counter and do the job efficiently if all this was going on at home? They found it hard to imagine that you wouldn't have totally collapsed emotionally if you were experiencing this. And there was a sort of search for reasons why this must be untrue. And it was very interesting to me, the ways in which unconscious biases feed on stereotypes, feed on myths about certain kinds of peoples from Nigeria being, capable of all sorts of, because they're smart, sharp people, that they're capable of all sorts of fraudulent behavior. Assumptions about men from the Caribbean, assumptions about the sexuality of Black men. That's all manner of things that somewhere deep in the interstices and in the hearts of people live on. And you have to really encourage people to look and see whether these things are affecting how they make judgments, whether people in front of them have credibility, or whether you're not believing them and not attributing credit to them because you're hostile to aspects of their life story.
I mean, this is so powerful, Helena, because I remember a quote a quote from you where you said something like, what all women deserve is to be able to choose freely the lives they want to lead, free of oppression and exploitation, filled with opportunity to be who they want to be. It is all about human rights. But and that obviously when we're talking about unconscious bias, because what you've said is so powerful, and about the stereotypes, whether it's Nigerian, whether it's battered women, whether it's Caribbean, whether it's, Asian people, it doesn't matter. It's all of these expectations that people have of stereotypical behavior. But where does that come from for you personally, Helena? I mean, you talk about being brought up in a working class Scottish, Irish sectarian, family, and you are where you are now. So what kind of unconscious bias influences would you have had to go down that path of being a lawyer and defending women and others?
Well, of course, my grandmother, I remember as a child, the horror that was felt when my grandmother's great friend came with this terribly pained story that her daughter was marrying a Protestant. And the idea that a Catholic girl was going to abandon her faith and marry a Protestant was considered the most grievous of hurts that someone could visit upon their family, and of course she was exiled, because of it. And those things happened. They happened in Irish families and in Northern Irish families, in divided communities, where those hostilities lived on, and those ideas that the other side of a divide was pariah, that they were outcasts if you crossed those lines. And
so that was kind of embedded in you, is that what you're saying? You grew up with these stories around you all the time. Yes, and you kind of took it for granted. Is that what you're saying?
Well, as a small child, I remember listening and being aware of those things. And then of course, I have to tell you, so if you want to ask me about my own prejudices, my prejudices are against fundamentalist religion. I don't like fundamentalist religion of any kind. I don't like it when it's fundamentalist Catholicism, Christianity. I don't like fundamentalism, which has hard rules. And I don't like it when I see it in Islam, and I don't like it when I see it as extreme forms of Judaism. I don't like it in any area where people adopt such fundamentalist views that the other becomes a pariah.
But that's now, though, isn't it? And that's what the benefit of hindsight. But let's get back to when you're 10 or 11 or 15, and you're still very much with your parents and the influence that you have around you. Was there any particular moment that you suddenly had this kind of, for want of a better word, insight or aha moment, and accepting that this particular way of behavior is something you want to fight against and you want to do something different? Was there any particular experience that made you think differently?
It became very clear to me by the time I was in my adolescence, and I was reading widely and reading great novels and reading about people in other parts of the world and the lives that people live, and the common thread is our common humanity, and the idea that somehow that someone was different by virtue of their religious convictions. I began questioning it when I was 13, 14, 15, because I was reading so widely. I was a bookworm. I loved books, and I read widely. And I have to say that my own parents were not bigoted. My grandparents, most certainly, my grandmother on my mother's side certainly was. And my own parents were critical of that. My father particularly, because he'd been in the army, he'd traveled and been with men from many different backgrounds, and he hated that kind of thing. And so the questioning began in my early teens. And then, of course, I came to study in London. And when I was here, it was the wonder of being in a world in which so many of the people I was studying with came from other parts of the world, were so different, and I did feel, for a period I felt very angry with my own church, with Catholicism. I felt very angry with it. And of course, it frightened the life out of my poor mother. I was so angry with the Catholic Church's way of dealing with women, its teachings on certain things, but particularly its attitudes towards women, because this was the 70s. And I was becoming, I was learning about feminism and about the rights of women, and I started reviewing so many of those things that had been sort of the bricks on which my life had been built. But then, of course, as you get into your, if you like, more adulthood, you start to make peace with some of those things, and you know that there are some of those things that and the values that you had in your teachings as a child, which actually were good, which actually were about your responsibility to others, and my own parents were good people, and so but there was no doubt that I was brought up in a community where I hardly knew a Protestant when I was growing up in Glasgow. I really didn't. We didn't mix. I went to Catholic schools. Our social life was all with people who were like ourselves. And so I knew nothing about people from other religions, but we were very good friends with my mother had Jewish friends. She was brought up in a poor immigrant part of Glasgow, where the immigrant communities were from Ireland or for people who'd fled Eastern Europe or Poland or wherever. And so my mother had close women friends who were Jewish. And so, but we were all given a hard time by the dominant Protestant community. And we knew that when my aunt applied for jobs and so on, it was clear that you'd gone to Catholic schools or you had a Catholic, if Mary was in your name, that was another indicator that you were a Catholic. Right. And so your chances of getting certain kinds of jobs were just not available to you. So there was that horrible sort of sense of being a community that was disadvantaged, and so those things, they for me, I think they informed the way in which I became a lawyer, because I wanted to give voice to people who had little voice within our institutions, within our society. It gave me an understanding of that, and also I kind of, the greater precepts of Catholicism still appeal to me, and but I feel very angry still that Catholicism has marginalized women, and in putting women on a pedestal with Mary, actually disempower women. And
it does, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
But I was also thinking about another aspect of, I mean, I know, for example, that you had a very close friendship with the famous photographer Eve Arnold, the Magnum photographer. And she was known, I mean, I know that a lot of people think of her as Marilyn Monroe's photographer, but she was also known for taking photographs of, for want of a better word, the underdog, like the potato pickers, and was a friend of Malcolm X and so on. And I'm just, your friendships, you mentioned earlier that you implicitly, unconsciously kind of connected with people who you felt a connection with. Those were your friends. So I'm just trying to explore this idea of unconscious bias and friendships. And someone like Eve Arnold, I mean, would she have influenced you implicitly without your even realizing, for example?
Oh, it's that famous thing that we are a part of all that we have met, and she undoubtedly was a really important person in my life. She became a very good and close friend. I mean, she was a lot older than me, but I adored her. And I have many of her photographs here in my home. She was a remarkable woman, and she was an intellectual. She took photographs of and is famed for many of her beautiful photographs of Marilyn Monroe, but the photographs that showed Marilyn Monroe to be more than just a glamour girl. Marilyn Monroe, who was a figure that was thoughtful and who was anti-racist herself. I mean, Marilyn Monroe, I mean, I don't know that people know, but Marilyn Monroe really stood out on racism. And when Ella Fitzgerald was being banned from clubs in performing because she was Black, Marilyn Monroe took a table in a club in Los Angeles and sat there on regular occasions and turned everything around for Ella Fitzgerald.
I had no idea. Thank you for that story.
Yeah, Eve knew Marilyn at another level and knew her in a different way. But and through Eve, I met wonderful people. And we were friends with Maya Angelou, the great Black American poet and writer and novelist. She was a remarkable woman, Eve Arnold. And of course, that's the great thing about life, is that if you open yourself and shed those unconscious biases, those fears of people whom you think, for example, might be hostile to you. I mean, that's one of the things that as one watches what's unraveling in the United States, and to see white supremacism and so on, that fear of wanting to live alongside people who are different, to deal with the original sin of slavery. I mean, by God, it contaminated the United States from the very beginning. Until that is dealt with, then there's going to be great division in the United States. And I have to say that coming to London and studying alongside people who came from the Caribbean, from Africa, from India and Pakistan to study law at the Innscourt School of Law, I loved that, and I was there with them. There was a great cohort of upper-class white men, but my interest was in all the different people who came from so many parts of the world to become lawyers.
I love that. But you said, Helena, that it's about really trying to. I'm paraphrasing what you said, but look at the world more openly and more, be more accepting. But the problem is that most of us, because we have biases, we don't know that we have them. They're unconscious, they're implicit. And so we might just fall back into the same old routine of what to expect and fall back into the stereotypes. So how do you personally manage your introspection and your unconscious biases?
Well, one of the things that was important in my sort of evolution was that when you're at the bar and you're doing a case, and I was a sort of warrior on behalf of people who were often, the underdog, as you've mentioned. There is a thing about doing a case, and it may be a culture that's created at the English bar, which was that you would fight hammer and tongs with the person on the other side. But somehow afterwards, you were still part of the same world, which was to preserve the rule of law. And so it was one of the things that was an important part of maturing, was that you don't loathe the person who's on the other side, and it's very interesting because it's like that in the House of Lords. You may have very different views from people, and you may absolutely disagree with them on politics and on policy, but there's a way in which you have to find a way of having a proper discourse, even when you feel that you have very little that you share in your worldview. There has to be some way in which you can cross that divide if you want to make any kind of progress. It's like the business that's going on just now. Now, look at the arguments that are taking place about China and human rights. Now, I've been talking about China and human rights, I have to tell you, for most of my adult life because of the horrible things that have happened in China. But at the moment, we have to make a decision. We have to be, on the one hand, fierce in our protection of human rights, of the Uyghur, of the people who are being persecuted, of the citizens who speak about human rights in China and who are absolutely tormented and persecuted in ways that are horrifying. And we have to speak out about that, and we have to try and bring them to the table. But we do have to try and bring them to the table. We have to try and find a way of having a conversation with China about why the world is angry about the abuse that is taking place. And of course, what China would say to us, is that great old word that was thrown around during the Brexit debacle here in Britain, is they will say, it's about sovereignty. We can do what we like inside our own borders. But what we all tried to do after the Second World War was to actually break down some of those borders, those barriers, and to create some kind of shared set of values where we had to try and have some sort of rules-based world, and to draw everybody into a consensus around them. And we have to try and do that again. So while we might abhor the views and the things that are happening in places in the world, we also have to find ways of drawing people into conversation, getting them to come to the table, not just slamming each other with criticism, and that's hard. It's there are times when I feel so enraged by what people do. I mean, I went earlier last year with Agnes Kalamar, the rapporteur for the United Nations who deals with extrajudicial killing. And Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi Arabian journalist and critic of the regime, had been murdered in Turkey. And I went out as a legal expert on that team, and we listened to that man being murdered. The tapes that Turkey unveiled the fact that they had been bugging the consulate, and therefore they had the evidence of what happened. Otherwise, we would never have known. And listening and hearing the terror in growing in a man who entered that consulate confident and speaking in a confident way, and you hear his voice as it would be when he was interviewed on television. And then suddenly he realizes that he's facing death in the eye. And these people who had come there to kill him, descending upon him, and the way in which he was killed was horrifying.
It was. And
all I can tell you is that I do feel a huge rage against the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, because I don't feel that he has taken full responsibility for that outrage. And I don't feel that the world has condemned it enough. And I have to keep saying to myself, is my rage about any form of a particular kind of bias because I can't stand the hypocrisy of the way in which this man lives his life, and some of his confederates do, enjoying the riches while at the same time pretending about something to do with religion and adherence to certain precepts. And let me assure you, I have to stop myself feeling deep-seated bias when I come to confronting some of the people who I feel are responsible for wrongdoing. And the thing about it is that when you allow bias to enter into your framing of accusations, it can actually it can destroy your case, because the appearance of bias can make it clear can make people doubt the truthfulness of the accusation or the strength of the evidence. And so it's very important that we find that we identify the ways in which we are allowing ourselves to be motored by some kind of bias.
Oh, that's extremely powerful. It's whether it's, I mean, we would never be in the experience, have the experiences that you do in terms of being a barrister or a lawyer and defending the kind of cases that you are. But we can still learn from what you just said to us. because it is about really consciously listening and engaging and not jumping to conclusions. It could be that simple, whether you're a Tory and I'm a Labour supporter, and that means I don't agree with anything you say, is silly. Listen and engage and explore, rather than just making an assumption that I'm right and you are wrong, or the other way around. No, I mean, this has been wonderful.
But there is an interesting thing, which is that I do remember doing a case where I was acting for someone who was accused of child abuse. And it was a very difficult case for me to do. I'm the mother of 3 children, and acting for this man was hard. And as a barrister, you have to somehow deal with, and they're not even unconscious biases, but in there are the biases that that you might have, that child abuse is so horrifying and comes very close to home if you're a parent of young children. But the even deeper unconscious things that you might feel, and you have to somehow be aware in order to put it to one side. If you aren't aware and don't question yourself, then you can't say, I put it over here and I'm not going to let it interfere with my performance on behalf of this man and putting his case to this jury and to this court.
That's hard. How do you do that? I mean, seriously.
No, but it is hard. There are times, obviously it becomes easier the more experienced you are, and the more the more you're in the profession, and you become accustomed to doing it. But it is hard, and there are times when it's harder, and when some cases will really try test your professionalism, and you have to. And I think that you can't, while you're denying that you have any of those emotions, then I think that you're taking risks of letting bias affect you. But you have to identify your very strong biases and unconscious biases in order to try to put them to one side.
That makes an awful lot of sense, absolutely. So first become aware of it, and then based on the situation you're in, put it to a side and really focus on the job at hand, whatever that might be.
Yes. I remember once representing a young man, and it was in relation to a terrorism matter. And I was chatting to him about his family. And my junior counsel in it was a young man. And my client went into his wallet and took out a photograph to show me a photograph of his children. But his wife was in the photograph, and he put his thumb over his wife's face so that my male colleague who was working with me on the case did not put his eyes on his wife. And I felt a sense of horror that the assumption was that this young man who was with me working on this case and working so hard, that he would cast his eyes on this woman and somehow be coveting her or thinking of her in some kind of sexual way. It was so inappropriate and such a kind of folly of this man, and I felt hostile to him for doing that. And I had to say, this is his belief system, and I have to just accept it and move on. But I remember the sense of hostility that I felt towards him, my own client, because of his attitude to women. That women were basically always capable of taking people towards sin, of leading men to sin, and therefore need to be covered.
We could talk forever and ever. Your stories are so powerful, Helena. I'm so appreciative that you've made the time.
No.
for all of us to hear your stories and to understand. So any last kind of, I don't know, you've given us lots of advice already, but any last advice, top tips you can give all of us listeners on how we can manage our unconscious biases?
No, I think that it's, we really have to reflect on the things that creep in to our way of seeing other people, and address them and seek to address them. And I really do. I mean, you said earlier on something very important. You said this is really in some ways about human rights. It is, because one of the things is the thing that we all share, the yearnings that we all have, that we all yearn to love and be loved, that we all want to know and understand. We all want to be treated with respect, and not to be disrespected. And so even the kids on the street who say, "Don't diss me," it's about feeling that they're being treated as lesser. And so, and we're all capable of doing that to each other. And so we have to be mindful. I mean, I think that actually it is about a level of mindfulness helping us towards recognizing our own ways in which we make those judgments of others, and be more open to seeing the good in the other. And
that is so moving and so powerful. Baroness Helena Kennedy, thank you so very much for sharing your stories of unconscious bias.
Lovely to meet you and to be with you.
This is the final episode of Season 4. As always, I want to thank the inspirational, thought-provoking speakers without whom I could not have this podcast series. To give you time to catch up with the podcasts you have missed, Season 5 will begin in a few weeks. Please do share, rate and review, as word of mouth is the best recommendation I could have. I'm going to end by quoting Helena Kennedy, who you have just heard. She says, "We all yearn to love and be loved. We all want to know and understand. We all want to be treated with respect and not to be disrespected. And we're all capable of showing disrespect to each other. So we have to be mindful. It is about a level of mindfulness helping us towards recognizing our own ways in which we can make those judgments of others and be more open to seeing the good in the other." Until next time.